in the town of Eisenach, beneath the shadow of the Wartburg where Martin Luther once hid and translated the New Testament into German, there was a house on a corner where music was not an ornament but a form of breath. The year was 1685, late March, when winter still held the valleys, but the light was beginning to lengthen. In this house a child was born who would be named Johann Sebastian, the youngest of 8 children, and he entered a world where every room held an instrument, where uncles and cousins and brothers all made their living with their hands on keyboards and strings, where music was the family trade the way other families worked, leather or baked bread. The Bach family had been musicians for so long that the very word Bach in that part of Thuringia meant musician. If you said you were going to hear the town Bach, you meant the town musician, and it was understood that he would be a member of this sprawling clan that had spread across the small courts and free cities of central Germany like a benevolent infestation. They played for weddings and funerals, for town councils and church services, for dances and processions. They were craftsmen of sound, respectable and necessary, neither wealthy nor poor, occupying that solid middle ground of German burgher life, where skill and reliability were worth more than innovation. Johann Sebastian's father, Johann Ambrosius, was the town musician of Eisenach, which meant he played violin for civic occasions and organized other musicians and dealt with the town council about pay and scheduling. He had a twin brother, Johann Christoph, who looked so much like him that even their wives could not always tell them apart, and this twin worked in another town doing exactly the same work. Music ran in the blood so thickly that it seemed less a choice than an inheritance, like the color of eyes. The house would have been full of sound, not the refined sound of a concert hall, which did not yet exist in the way we understand it, but the working sound of people practicing, of students being taught, of music as daily labor, a violin being tuned, a boy working through a difficult passage on the harpsichord, someone singing a chorale, the knock of a bow against wood, the shuffle of manuscript pages. In this world, the child grew, and music was not something you decided to pursue. It was simply the air. But the air changed when he was 9 years old. His mother died in May of 1694, and his father followed her 8 months later, in February of 1695. The household dissolved. The children were parceled out to relatives. Johann Sebastian, not yet 10, went to live with his eldest brother, Johann Christoph, who was 14 years older and had married and settled in the town of Ohrdruf, about 30 miles southeast, where he served as organist at the Church of St. Michael. This was not an unusual arrangement for the time. Children were often sent to live with relatives, especially when they could be useful, and Johann Sebastian could already play and had a fine voice. But it marked the first great rupture in his life, the first sense that the world was not stable, that what you knew could vanish. He walked or rode in a cart to Ohrdruf, leaving behind the town of his birth, and moved into his brother's house, where there were soon more children, less space, and a stricter regime. His brother was a capable organist, trained by Johann Pachelbel, who was himself a significant figure in the South German organ tradition. In Ohrdruf, Johann Sebastian attended the Lyceum, a Latin school, where he studied rhetoric and theology and received a solid grounding in the Lutheran curriculum. He sang in the church choir. He studied keyboard with his brother, working through the standard pedagogical pieces of the time. He was a good student, diligent and quick, and his reports show him near the top of his class despite being younger than many of his peers. But there was something else. There was a hunger that went beyond competence. His brother owned a manuscript book, a collection of works by the leading composers of the day, Froberger, Pachelbel, and others, and this book was kept in a locked cabinet not because the music was secret, but perhaps because the manuscript was valuable, or because the brother believed his younger sibling was not yet ready for it. But Johann Sebastian wanted that music. He wanted it with the kind of desperation that has nothing to do with reason. The story, passed down through family memory and written down years later, says that he spent 6 months copying the manuscript in secret by moonlight. The cabinet had a grill, and his hands were small enough to reach through and pull the book out. He worked at night, presumably by candlelight or whatever pale moon came through the window, and copied the entire volume by hand. Copying music was standard practice. There was no other way to possess it, but doing it in secret at night as a child transforms the act into something else. It becomes an act of devotion, of theft, of need. When his brother discovered what he had done, he confiscated the copy. This part of the story has the cruelty of ordinary life, the kind of small injustice that costs nothing and means everything. The brother was not a villain. He was a working musician with a family and responsibilities, and perhaps he thought the boy needed to learn discipline, needed to progress in the proper order. But the boy had already tasted something beyond order, and he would spend the rest of his life chasing it. He stayed in Ohrdruf until he was 15, and then, in March of 1700, he left for the town of Lüneburg, more than 200 miles north, near Hamburg. He went with a school friend, and the reason for the journey was practical. The St. Michael's School in Lüneburg offered positions in its Mettenchor, a choir for boys of modest means with good voices. The positions came with a stipend and free education. It was a way forward. The journey itself would have taken weeks on foot, through the patchwork of territories that made up the Holy Roman Empire, past towns and forests and fields, still working their way out of winter. He was 15, effectively alone, carrying what he owned. When he arrived in Lüneburg, he entered a new world. The school was attached to a wealthy monastery. The library was substantial. The diary was substantial. The town was larger and more cosmopolitan than anything he had known. And only 30 miles away was Hamburg, one of the great musical centers of northern Germany, where the organist of the St. Catherine's Church was Johann Adam Renken, a man in his 70s who represented the pinnacle of the North German organ tradition. Bach went to Hamburg to hear Renken play. It is likely he went more than once, walking the 30 miles there and back because he had no money for a coach. He would have heard an instrument larger and more varied than anything in Thuringia, and a style of playing that was bold and improvisatory, full of dramatic flourishes and extended fantasias that treated the organ not as a servant of the liturgy, but as a kind of cathedral in itself, vast and astonishing. This was a different aesthetic from what he had learned from his brother. It was wilder, more rhetorical, less concerned with correctness and more with effect. In Lüneburg he also encountered French music. The school had connections to the nearby court, and Bach seems to have heard or played the elegant, ornamented style of the French Baroque, the music of Lully and the clavicinists, full of graceful dance rhythms and refined decoration. This, too, was new. He was collecting materials, absorbing everything, building an internal library. His voice broke, as voices do, and he could no longer sing soprano, but he stayed at the school, working as an accompanist and perhaps already composing, though almost nothing survives from this period. What we know is that he finished his studies in 1702 and began looking for work. He was 17 years old, trained in organ and keyboard and singing and composition, fluent in Latin, versed in theology and rhetoric, and he needed a position. He found one in Weimar, a small duchy about 100 miles south, where he was hired as a court musician, probably playing violin or serving as a general assistant in the ducal chapel. The position did not last long. Within a few months he moved again, this time to Arnstadt, even closer to his birthplace, where the new church needed an organist, and Bach, not yet 19, was offered the post. Arnstadt was a small town, conservative and quiet, and the church was new, with a new organ built by Johann Friedrich Winder, a fine instrument with 2 manuals and pedals. Bach tested the organ and accepted the position in August of 1703. His duties were not onerous. He was to play for services on Sunday mornings and Thursday prayer meetings, to keep the organ in good repair, and to rehearse with the students who made up the church choir. His salary was modest but sufficient. He had lodgings, he had an instrument, he had time, and he used that time not to settle in but to keep searching. In October of 1705 he asked for 4 weeks' leave to travel to Lübeck, more than 250 miles north, to hear the Abendmusiken, the famous evening concerts given by Diederik Buxtehude, the aging master of the North German organ school, the man whose music had circulated in manuscripts, the man whose improvisations were legendary. Bach walked most of the way, or perhaps caught rides with merchants, and stayed in Lübeck not 4 weeks, but 4 months. What he heard there changed everything. Buxtehude was in his late 60s, a composer and organist of astonishing skill who had built the Abendmusiken into elaborate multi-part performances that combined organ, voices, and instruments, sacred and dramatic at once. The music was monumental and free, structured by theology, but unafraid of spectacle. Bach absorbed it all, studying the older man's techniques, his registration, his use of counterpoint in ornamentation, and when he finally returned to Arnstadt in February of 1706, he had been gone 3 times longer than he had permission for. The church council was not pleased. They summoned him and asked why he had overstayed his leave. They complained that his playing had become too elaborate, too strange, that he confused the congregation with odd harmonies and extended improvisations, when what they wanted was simple support for the hymns. They complained that he had not been adequately rehearsing the choir, that he had called one of the students a nanny goat bassoonist, and that a fight had broken out in the street afterward. They asked him to explain himself. He did not apologize. He seems to have been polite but unyielding. He had gone to Lübeck to learn, and he had learned. If his playing was now too complex for them, that was not his problem. The tension between Bach and the authorities at Arnstadt did not resolve. It became a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. He knew what music should be, and he had little patience for those who did not. In June of 1707, he accepted a new position as organist at the Church of St. Blaise in Mühlhausen, a free imperial city about 35 miles northwest of Arnstadt. The organ was larger, the salary better, the town more prosperous. He moved in July, and in October he married Maria Barbara Bach, a cousin from the Arnstadt branch of the family. She was 23, he was 22. They had known each other since childhood. The wedding was quiet, held in the small village where her family lived. Mühlhausen should have been a good fit. He composed a cantata for the inauguration of the new town council, a large, confident work with trumpets and drums, and it was well received. He drew up plans for renovating the organ at St. Blaise, specifying the changes in careful detail, demonstrating a practical knowledge of organ building that he would carry throughout his life. He seemed to be settling in, but Mühlhausen was a town divided by theology. The pastor of St. Blaise was a pietist, favoring inward devotion and simplicity in worship, suspicious of elaborate church music as a distraction from true faith. Other clergy in the town were Orthodox Lutherans, who believed that music was a vital part of worship, a way of glorifying God through craft and beauty. Bach found himself in the middle of this quarrel, and his instincts were entirely on the side of music. He believed, though he would not have put it this way yet, that music was a form of theology, that counterpoint could be prayer, that structure and spirit were not opposed but identical. After only a year, he resigned. In his letter to the town council, he was respectful but clear. He wanted a position where he could develop a well-regulated church music to the glory of God. Mühlhausen could not offer that, but Weimar could. The ducal court at Weimar had offered him the position of court organist and chamber musician, with a better salary and the promise of resources. In June of 1708, he and Maria Barbara moved to Weimar, and he began what would become the most productive period of his early life. Weimar was not a major court, but it was a court with a chapel and a small orchestra, and a duke who fancied himself a patron of the arts. Bach's duties were to play organ for the chapel services and to perform chamber music for the duke. The organ was excellent, the position secure, and for the first time he had colleagues who were professional musicians, people he could work with and learn from. He stayed for 9 years, from 1708 to 17, and in that time he composed most of his greatest organ works. The toccata and fugue in D minor, if it is indeed his, which scholars still debate. The Passacaglia and fugue in C minor, a colossal structure built on a repeating bass line, 20 variations that build and build until the fugue arrives like a cathedral on fire. The Orgelbuchlein, a collection of short chorale preludes intended as teaching pieces, each one a meditation on a Lutheran hymn, each one a small, perfect world. The preludes and fugues that would later be called the Great 18, though he revised them later in life. These works were not written for publication. There was no real market for published organ music. They were written for his own use, for his students, for the glory of God and the development of the art. They circulated in manuscript among those who knew, and they represent a synthesis of everything he had absorbed, the North German grandeur of Buxtehude and Renken, the South German clarity of Pachelbel, the contrapuntal rigor he had learned by copying and studying, and something new, something entirely his, a density of thought and feeling that made every measure count. At the same time, he was beginning to explore another world. The court at Weimar had a small collection of Italian music, and Bach encountered the concertos of Antonio Vivaldi, which were being published in Amsterdam and circulating widely. Vivaldi's music was a revelation. It was direct, rhythmic, full of clear contrasts and driving energy, organized around the ritornello principle and opening theme that returns, framing episodes of contrasting material. It was the opposite of the dense, continuous counterpoint Bach had been trained in, and he loved it. He began transcribing Vivaldi's concertos for keyboard, not just copying them, but rethinking them, adapting the string writing to the keyboard, filling out the harmonies, adding inner voices. He transcribed concertos by Vivaldi, by Alessandro Marcello, by others, and in the process he learned how to think in terms of large-scale structure, how to build a movement that breathed and moved and arrived somewhere. The Italian influence seeped into his own concertos and would eventually shape some of his most characteristic works. His family was growing. Maria Barbara gave birth to their first child, Katharina Dorothea, in December of 1708, just months after they arrived in Weimar. A son, Wilhelm Friedemann, followed in November of 1710. Then twins who died shortly after birth in February of 1713. Then twins who died shortly after birth in February of 17. Then Carl Philipp Emanuel in March of 1714, and Johann Gottfried Bernhard in May of 1715. The household was full of noise and need, and Bach was composing and teaching and performing, and the children grew up in a house where music was always being made. In March of 1714, Bach was promoted to Concertmeister, a position that came with a raise and a new duty. He was to compose a cantata every month for the ducal chapel. This was the beginning of his systematic work in the cantata form, the genre that would dominate the next phase of his life. A cantata, in this context, was a multi-movement work for voices and instruments based on the scripture readings and hymns for a particular Sunday in the Lutheran liturgical calendar. It was functional music, church music, but in Bach's hands it became something more. He composed more than 20 cantatas in Weimar, and they show him learning how to set text, how to write for voices, how to integrate chorales and arias and recitatives into a unified structure. These are not his greatest cantatas. Those would come later, but they are ambitious and serious, and they show him thinking about how music can carry theological meaning, how a fugue can depict the resurrection, how a chorale can anchor a listener in the communal faith. But Weimar, like every position before it, eventually soured. In December of 1716, the Kapellmeister, the director of all court music, died. Bach expected to be promoted to the position. He had seniority, skill, and the respect of the musicians. But the Duke passed him over and gave the position to the Kapellmeister's son, a man of less talent and experience. The insult was clear. Bach began looking for another position, and by the summer of 17, he had found one. Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Köthen, a small principality about 80 miles northeast, had offered him the position of Kapellmeister at a substantially higher salary. Köthen was a Calvinist court, which meant there would be no elaborate church music, but the prince was a music lover and a capable musician himself, and he promised Bach the resources and freedom to compose. Bach asked the Duke of Weimar for permission to leave. The Duke refused. Bach persisted. In November of 1717, he was arrested and imprisoned for nearly a month for his obstinacy in demanding his release. The court secretary's record states that he was confined for too stubbornly forcing the issue of his dismissal. He was finally released and dismissed in disgrace on December 6. He moved to Köthen in December of 17, and for the first time in his life he was free from church employment. Prince Leopold maintained a small but excellent ensemble of about 18 musicians, and Bach's job was to compose for them, conduct them, and perform with them. There were no cantatas to write, no organ to play for services. Instead, he composed chamber music, orchestral music, music for pleasure and instruction. The Brandenburg concertos were composed in Köthen, or at least compiled and dedicated there. They are 6 concertos, each one different in instrumentation and character, sent as a gift to the Margrave of Brandenburg in March of 1721, presumably in hope of patronage that never materialized. The Margrave seems not to have performed them. After his death they were appraised at a few pennies and sold off, but they represent the peak of the Baroque concerto, each one a study in color and dialogue, instruments conversing and blending. The sonatas and cantatas for solo violin were composed in Köthen, 6 works that pushed the violin to its limits, treating it as if it were a polyphonic instrument capable of suggesting multiple voices at once. The chaconne from the D minor partita is alone worth a lifetime, a quarter-hour of continuous variation on a 4-bar theme, a work of such depth and intensity that later musicians would struggle to explain it. Brahms once wrote that if he could have conceived the chaconne, he would have gone mad with excitement. The suites for solo cello were likely composed in Köthen as well, though the dating is uncertain. 6 suites that explore the cello's range and character, each one built around a sequence of dance movements, elegant and physically demanding. They are among the most beloved works in the cello repertoire, and they were nearly lost. The manuscripts survived by accident, copied out by Bach's second wife years later, and they were not widely known until the 20th century, when Pablo Casals began performing them. And then there is the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier, completed in Köthen in 1722. It is a collection of 24 preludes and fugues, one in each of the 12 major and 12 minor keys. The title page describes it as for the use and profit of young musicians desirous of learning, as well as for the pastime of those already skilled in this study. It was not the first collection to explore all the keys. Johann Caspar Ferdinand Fischer had published a similar work a few years earlier, but Bach's was different in ambition and scope. It was a demonstration that equal temperament tuning, where the octave is divided into 12 equal half-steps, was practical and musically viable. In older tuning systems, some keys sounded pure and beautiful, while others were harsh and unusable. Equal temperament made all keys equally available, though at the cost of making none of them perfectly in tune. It was a compromise, but it opened up the entire harmonic universe. Each prelude and fugue pair is a small world. The C major prelude is a rippling arpeggio study, serene and almost simple. The C major fugue is a 4-voice conversation, clear and bright. The C minor prelude is somber, chromatic, searching. The C minor fugue is dense and intense, each voice entering with the same theme and then weaving together into a structure that feels both inevitable and impossible. The collection is pedagogical, but it is also visionary. It proves that you can write in any key and find beauty there. It trains the fingers and the ear and the mind. It has been the foundation of keyboard education for 3 centuries. Glenn Gould recorded it twice. Every serious pianist has lived with it. It is, in its quiet way, one of the supreme achievements of Western music, and it was written in a small court town for the instruction of students and the satisfaction of its maker. But Cuthen, for all its musical freedom, was fragile. Prince Leopold married in December of 1721, and his new wife was not interested in music. The prince's attention shifted. The budget for musicians began to shrink. And then, in July of 1720, while Bach was away with the prince at a spa town, Maria Barbara died. She was buried before he returned. The cause of her death is not recorded. She was 35 years old, and they had been married 13 years. He was left with 4 children. Katharina Dorothea was 11, Wilhelm Friedemann 9, Carl Philipp Emanuel 6, and Johann Gottfried Bernhard 5. 2 other children had died young. The household, which had been ordered around Maria Barbara's management, fell into disarray. Bach needed help. The children needed a mother. In December of 1721, just 5 months after Maria Barbara's death, he married Anna Magdalena Wilke, a singer at the court, 20 years old to his 36. She was the daughter of a court trumpeter, trained in music, capable and calm. She would bear him 13 more children over the years, of whom 6 survived to adulthood. She would copy his manuscripts, manage the household, sing his music, and endure the chaos of a life lived in service to sound. But by 1722, Bach was already looking beyond Cuthen. Prince Leopold's declining interest in music made the position less attractive, and Bach had children to educate. The Latin schools in Cuthen were inadequate. He wanted his sons to have the kind of education he had received, and that meant a larger city. In December of 1722, he applied for the position of cantor at the St. Thomas School in Leipzig, one of the most prestigious positions in Lutheran Germany. The cantor was responsible for the music at the 2 main churches, St. Thomas and St. Nicholas, and for teaching at the school. It was a demanding position, but it came with housing, a stable income, and access to a great city with a university and excellent schools. The position had been vacant for months. The town council had first offered it to Georg Philipp Telemann, who was the most famous composer in Germany at the time. But Telemann had used the offer to leverage a raise from his current employer in Hamburg and declined. They offered it to Christoph Graupner, another well-regarded composer, but his employer would not release him. Bach was the 3rd choice, and some members of the council were not enthusiastic. One councillor remarked, "Since we cannot have the best, we must settle for mediocrity." Bach accepted. In May of 1723, he moved to Leipzig with his family, and he would remain there for the rest of his life, 27 years, until his death in 1750. Leipzig was a prosperous commercial city, a center of trade and publishing, with a university and a vibrant intellectual life. The position of cantor was demanding and tangled in bureaucracy. Bach was responsible for providing music for the Sunday and feast day services at St. Thomas and St. Nicholas, which meant composing or arranging a cantata every week. He was also responsible for music at the 2 smaller churches, St. Peter's and the New Church, though he usually delegated this to students or assistants. He had to teach Latin and music to the boys at the St. Thomas School, supervise their daily routines, and attend to their discipline. He had to negotiate with the town council about budgets and salaries, with the school board about repairs and supplies, and with the church authorities about the repertoire and the quality of the musicians. He hated the bureaucracy. He filed complaints about the quality of the student singers, about the lack of funds for professional musicians, about the interference of the authorities in artistic decisions. He was difficult, unbending, certain of his own judgment, but he did the work. For the first few years in Leipzig, he composed at a rate that seems almost inhuman. He needed a cantata for every Sunday and feast day, and in his first 2 years he composed 2 complete annual cycles, more than 100 cantatas. Some were reworkings of earlier pieces, but most were new. He wrote on Wednesday and Thursday, rehearsed on Friday and Saturday, performed on Sunday, and began again. Each cantata was a theological and musical meditation on the day's scripture readings and hymns. They are scored for voices and a small orchestra strings, oboes, sometimes flutes or trumpets, organ and continuo, and they range from 15 minutes to half an hour. Some are intimate and introspective, scored for a few voices and instruments. Others are grand and festive, with trumpets and drums and double choruses. The opening chorus is often a large, complex structure, weaving together the text and the chorale melody in intricate counterpoint, every voice meaningful, every instrument contributing. Then come recitatives, where the narrative or theological point is made, and arias where a single voice reflects on the meaning, often in partnership with an obbligato instrument and oboe, a violin that becomes a second voice. The cantata typically ends with a simple four-part chorale sung by the congregation or the choir, grounding the whole work in communal worship. They are uneven because they were written under pressure and with varying resources, but the best of them are astonishing. And Festedberg ist unser Gott, based on Luther's great hymn, is a fortress in sound. Wachet auf, ruft uns thy stem, is radiant and expectant, built on the parable of the wise and foolish virgins. Hevs Mund und Tata und Leben contains the chorale that is now known as Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, though that title is a later invention. By his third year in Leipzig, Bach had slowed down. He had composed enough cantatas to cover the liturgical year, and he began recycling and revising earlier works. His attention shifted to other projects. In 1724 he composed the St. John Passion, a musical setting of the Passion narrative from the Gospel of John, performed on Good Friday. It is a large-scale work lasting about 2 hours with choruses, arias, recitatives, and chorales telling the story of Jesus' arrest, trial, and crucifixion. The St. John Passion is intense and dramatic, full of violent contrasts, the crowd shouting "Crucify him!" in jagged, aggressive choruses, and then moments of profound stillness, like the alto aria Es ist vollbracht. It is finished, where the voice and the viola da gamba circle each other in a kind of gentle mourning. In 1727 or 28, he composed the St. Matthew Passion, narrative from the Gospel of Matthew, even larger and more ambitious. It is scored for 2 choruses, 2 orchestras, soloists, and organ, and it lasts more than 3 hours. It is one of the largest and most complex works of the Baroque era, and it is also one of the most intimate because for all its grandeur, it is fundamentally about suffering and love. The St. Matthew Passion is structured as a series of tableaus. The narrative is told in recitative by the evangelist, a tenor, with other soloists singing the words of Jesus, Pilate, Peter, Judas. The choruses represent the disciples, the crowd, the faithful. Between the narrative scenes are arias and chorales, moments where the action stops and the listener is invited to reflect, to grieve, to understand. The opening chorus is a massive double choir structure, the 2 choirs calling to each other, "Come, ye daughters, share my mourning," while a third melody, a chorale sung by a separate group of sopranos, floats above like a voice from another world. It is overwhelming and beautiful, and it sets the tone for everything that follows. The aria Erbar me Dick, Have Mercy, comes after Peter has denied Jesus 3 times. It is sung by an alto accompanied by a solo violin that weeps in long, sustained lines, doubling and echoing the voice. It is one of the most affecting pieces of music ever written, and it distills the entire Passion into 5 minutes of sound. The St. Matthew Passion was performed on Good Friday of 1727 or 1728, and then it was not performed again in Bach's lifetime. It was too long, too difficult, too expensive. After his death, it was forgotten. The manuscript survived by accident, preserved by his son Carl Philipp Emanuel and later by a collector. It was not until March of 1829 that Felix Mendelssohn, then 20 years old, conducted a performance in Berlin that sparked the Bach revival. The hall was packed. People wept, and the music that had been silent for 80 years began to be heard again. But in 1727, Bach did not know this. He knew only that he had written a work that he believed in, and that it had been performed, and that he had other work to do. His relationship with the Leipzig authorities was always tense. He fought with the town council about money, about the quality of the student musicians, about his right to take on outside work. He fought with the rector of the St. Thomas School, Johann Sebastian, about control of the choir and the curriculum. He filed legal complaints, appealed to higher authorities, wrote stiff letters defending his prerogatives. He was not easy to work with because he would not compromise on what he believed music should be. In the 1730s, he seems to have grown tired of the endless battles over church music. He began to focus more on instrumental and keyboard works, and on projects that were for his own use and the use of other musicians, rather than for the church calendar. In 1731, he published the Clavier Bong I, a set of 6 keyboard partitas that he had been issuing individually over the previous few years. They are suites, each one a sequence of dance movements allemande, courante, sarabande, jiggle preceded by an elaborate opening movement. They are elegant and virtuosic, intended for amateur players, but rewarding for anyone. They were popular, and they sold well, which was unusual. Bach rarely published, and when he did, it was at his own expense. In 1735 he published Clavier Bung II, which contains the Italian Concerto and the French Overture, 2 large-scale works for harpsichord that demonstrate contrasting national styles. The Italian Concerto is bright and driving, modeled on Vivaldi, with the harpsichord imitating the texture of an orchestra. The French Overture is stately and ornamented, full of the dotted rhythms and elaborate decoration of the French style. In 1739, he published Clavier Bung III, a collection of organ works based on the Lutheran Catechism, framed by a massive prelude and fugue in E-flat major. The prelude is sometimes called the Saint Anne because its theme resembles a hymn tune by that name, though Bach almost certainly did not know it. The fugue is actually 3 fugues, one on top of the other, a demonstration of contrapuntal skill that almost no one else could have managed. And then, in 1741 or 42, he completed the second book of the Well-Tempered Clavier, another 24 preludes and fugues in all the major and minor keys. It is a companion to the first book, but it is different in character. Where the first book feels like a survey, an exploration, the second book feels like a summation, the work of someone who has nothing left to prove and is simply making music because it is what he does. The preludes are more varied, more experimental. Some are gentle and lyrical, some are bold and dramatic, some are fugues themselves, dense and intricate. The fugues are even more astonishing than in the first book, longer and more complex, full of inversions and augmentations and strettos, techniques that sound technical but are really just ways of making the music think harder, twist further, reveal more. The E-flat minor fugue from Book 2 is a slow, chromatic meditation, each voice entering quietly and building to a kind of hushed intensity. The B major fugue is light and dancing, almost playful. The B minor fugue is austere and relentless, a study in tension. Together, the 2 books of the Well-Tempered Clavier form a kind of Old Testament and New Testament of keyboard music, and they have shaped every pianist and composer who came after. In the 1740s, Bach's focus shifted even further inward. He became interested in projects that had no practical function, music written not for performance, but for study, for the working out of problems, for the demonstration of possibility. In 1747, he joined the Correspondierende Société der Musikalischen Wissenschaft, a society of musicians and theorists who were interested in the scientific and mathematical aspects of music. As part of his membership, he submitted a set of canonic variations on the Christmas hymn Vom Himmel hoch, a work of extraordinary complexity where the same melody is treated in different canons, each one a puzzle and a solution. Around the same time, he began work on what is now known as the musical offering. In May of 1747, he visited the court of Frederick the Great in Potsdam. Frederick was the king of Prussia, a flutist and a patron of the arts, and he had hired Bach's son Carl Philipp Emanuel as his court harpsichordist. When Bach arrived, Frederick gave him a theme and challenged him to improvise a fugue on it. Bach did so, and then the king asked him to improvise a 6-voice fugue on the same theme. Bach demurred, saying it would require preparation, but he promised to work it out properly and send it. He returned to Leipzig and composed the musical offering, a collection of pieces all based on Frederick's theme: a 3-voice fugue, a 6-voice fugue, a trio sonata, and a series of canons. The 6-voice fugue is one of the most complex pieces he ever wrote, a structure where 6 independent voices all make sense, all contribute, all sing. It is almost unplayable, though it has been arranged for various ensembles, and it exists more as an idea than as a sound, a proof that such a thing could be imagined. He published the musical offering and dedicated it to Frederick, who probably never looked at it. And then there is the art of fugue, the work that occupied the last years of his life. It is a collection of fugues and canons, all based on a single theme, exploring every possible contrapuntal technique. There are simple fugues, and double fugues, and triple fugues, and quadrupuntal technique. There are simple fugues and preludes and quadruple fugues, fugues inversion and augmentation, and diminution, fugues where the theme is turned upside down and backward and stretched and compressed. It is a demonstration of what fugue can do, and it is also a kind of testament, of final accounting. Bach did not specify what instruments should play the art of fugue. It is written in open score, like a study, and it can be performed on keyboard or by an ensemble or simply read. The final fugue, the 14th, is incomplete. It breaks off after 239 measures, at the point where Bach introduces his own name into the theme. BACH, in German notation, is B flat, AC, B natural, and then the manuscript ends. His son Carl Philipp Emanuel added a note. While working on this fugue, in which the name BHHA appears in the countersubject, the author died. Whether this is true, whether the fugue was truly unfinished or whether the ending was simply lost, is debated. But the image is too perfect to dismiss, the composer writing his own name into the music and then silence. By the late 1740s, Bach's eyesight was failing. He had always been nearsighted, and he had spent his life copying manuscripts and composing by candlelight, peering at tiny notes on crowded pages. Now he was going blind. In March and April of 1750, he underwent 2 eye surgeries performed by a traveling English oculist named John Taylor, who was more showman than doctor. The surgeries were catastrophic. Bach was left nearly blind and in great pain. He rallied briefly in July. His sight returned enough that he could see and tolerate light. He revised and dictated the final chorale prelude he would complete. Vor deinen Thron tret, ich heimit. Before your throne I now appear, a serene and simple setting of a hymn about approaching death. It is 26 measures long, perfectly proportioned, every note in place. If the art of fugue is unfinished, this is the true ending. On the evening of July 28, 1750, he suffered a stroke. He died a few hours later, just before midnight. He was 65 years old. He was buried in an unmarked grave at the St. John's Cemetery in Leipzig. The exact location was not recorded. When the cemetery was cleared in the late 19th century, a skeleton was exhumed that was believed to be his, based on the skull's measurements, and it was reburied at the St. Thomas Church, where a monument now stands. Whether it is really him is uncertain. His estate was inventoried and divided among his widow and children. It included 5 harpsichords, 2 lute harpsichords, a violin, 3 violas, 2 cellos, a viola da gamba, a lute, a spinet, and 52 sacred books. His manuscripts were divided among his sons. Many were lost. Some were sold for waste paper. Anna Magdalena was left with little. She died 10 years later in poverty, supported by charity. For a few decades, Bach was remembered primarily as an organist and a learned contrapuntist, old-fashioned even in his own time. His sons were more fat. Carl Philipp Emanuel was one of the leading composers of the next generation, a master of the expressive, gallant style that was replacing the Baroque. Wilhelm Friedemann was known as a brilliant improviser. Johann Christian, the youngest, became famous in London as a composer of operas and symphonies. But the manuscripts survived, at least some of them. Carl Philipp Emanuel kept many, and he sold some to collectors. Baron Gottfried van Swieten, a Viennese diplomat and music lover, collected Bach's music and held private concerts where it was performed. Mozart attended these concerts and copied out fugues. Astonished by the craft, Haydn studied the well-tempered clavier. Beethoven played it as a child and called Bach the father of harmony. The great turning point was Mendelssohn's performance of the St. Matthew Passion in 1829. It was an event. The audience included Hegel, the philosopher, and the poet Heinrich Heine, and the critic Adolf Bernhard Marx, who wrote that the performance was as if a mighty river, long buried beneath the earth, suddenly broke forth again. The performance sparked a revival, and within a few years the Bach Gesellschaft was founded to publish a complete edition of his works, a project that took half a century. The Romantics loved Bach because they heard in him a kind of Gothic grandeur, a spiritual and mathematical sublime. They did not always play him accurately. They added dynamics and phrasing that he never wrote. They used large orchestras and choirs where he had used small ensembles, but they believed in him. Schumann founded a Bach Society and published articles about him. Liszt transcribed his organ works for piano. Brahms kept a copy of the Mass in B minor by his bedside. In the 20th century, Bach was rediscovered again, this time with an emphasis on historical performance. Scholars worked to understand how he would have played and heard his music, what the instruments sounded like, what the tuning was, what the performance practices were. This led to a new sound, leaner, faster, more transparent, and to debates about what was authentic and what was invention. And then there was Glenn Gould, who recorded the Goldberg Variations in 1955, playing them faster and clearer than anyone had thought possible, and turned Bach into modern music. Gould's Bach was not devotional or monumental. It was precise, unsentimental, almost mechanical, and it revealed the architecture of the music in a way that was startling. He recorded the Goldberg Variations again in 1981, shortly before his death, and the second recording is slower, more inward, as if he had spent 26 years thinking about the same 32 movements and had found something else there. The Goldberg Variations, published in 1741 as the fourth part of the Clavier, Bung, are a set of 30 variations on a simple bass line, framed by an aria at the beginning and the same aria repeated at the end. They were supposedly commissioned by Count Kaiserlink, the Russian ambassador to Saxony, to be played by his harpsichordist Johann Gottlieb Goldberg, who had studied with Bach. The Count suffered from insomnia and wanted music to soothe him through the night. Whether the story is true does not matter. The Goldberg Variations are not soothing. They are a universe. Every third variation is a canon, starting with a canon at the unison and ending with a canon at the ninth. The other variations explore every possible keyboard technique: hand crossing, fast scales, slow suspensions, two-part inventions, mock overtures, a quadlibet that weaves together two popular songs of the day. The whole structure is a demonstration of what can be done with a single bass line, and it is also a journey, a meditation, a proof. Bach is everywhere now, so thoroughly absorbed into the culture that it is hard to remember there was a time when his music was not heard. He is in concert halls and churches and recordings. He is in films and advertisements. He is the sound of structure, of order, of the universe running along invisible lines. But he is also the sound of something else, something harder to name. The theologian and organist Albert Schweitzer, who wrote one of the great early biographies of Bach, said that his music was not an expression of emotion, but a depiction of emotion, that it stood outside the feeling and showed it to you, whole and clear. This is why it can be overwhelming, because you hear yourself in it without the usual defenses. There is a story that in the last months of his life, someone asked Bach how he had achieved so much, and he replied, "I had to work hard. Anyone who works as hard will get just as far." It is a very Bach answer, practical and unyielding, refusing the category of genius, insisting on craft. But it is not quite true. Plenty of people have worked as hard and not gotten as far. What he had was not just diligence but a kind of vision, a sense that music was not decoration or entertainment, but a language capable of saying things that could not be said any other way. He believed that music was a gift from God, and that to compose was to participate in the act of creation. He signed many of his manuscripts with the initials SDG Soli Deo Gloria, to God alone the glory. And he meant it. But the music he made was not abstract or otherworldly. It was physical, built from the movement of fingers and the vibration of air, and it was human, full of longing and joy and grief. The cantatas were written for ordinary Sundays, for congregations of shopkeepers and students and servants, and they are full of the concerns of ordinary life: anxiety about death, hope for grace, gratitude for harvest, fear of judgment. The chorale preludes take the hymns that everyone knew, the tunes that had been sung for generations, and show them from new angles, make them strange and familiar at the same time. The fugues are arguments, conversations, structures that build themselves out of a single idea and then reveal that the idea contained multitudes all along. He did not invent counterpoint. It had been developing for centuries before him, and other composers used it brilliantly. But he perfected it, or rather he showed what it could become if you pursued it with absolute rigor and absolute freedom. In his hands, counterpoint was not a technique, but a form of thought, a way of understanding how things relate, how independent voices can move together without losing their independence, how complexity and clarity are not opposed. The fugue is the purest expression of this, a fugues with a subject, a short melody, stated alone. Then another voice enters with the same subject, while the first voice continues with new material. Then a third voice, and sometimes a fourth, or a fifth, or a sixth, each one entering with the subject, and then weaving into the texture. The voices move according to the rules of harmony and counterpoint, but within those rules they are free, and the result is a structure that feels both predetermined and spontaneous, both logical and miraculous. Bach wrote hundreds of fugues, and no two are alike. Some are short and playful, some are long and severe, some build slowly, adding voices and layers until the texture is almost overwhelming. Some are spare and clean, but all of them share the same quality. They feel necessary. Every note is there, because it has to be there, because the logic of the music demands it, and yet the logic is never dry or mechanical. It sings. There is a paradox at the heart of Bach's music. It is the most structural, the most mathematical, the most rule-bound music ever written, and it is also the most expressive, the most spiritual, the most alive. The two things are not in tension. They are the same thing. The structure is the expression. The rules are the freedom. This is why his music has endured, why it has been played and studied and loved for 3 centuries, why it continues to mean something to people who have no interest in the Baroque or in Christianity or in theory. It speaks to something fundamental about how we think and feel, about the relationship between order and emotion, between the individual and the whole, between time and eternity. In the B minor Mass, which he compiled in the last years of his life from earlier compositions and new material, he set the entire Latin Mass text in a work of vast proportions, nearly 2 hours long, scored for soloists, chorus, and orchestra. It was never performed in his lifetime, and it is not clear why he wrote it. He was a Lutheran working in a Lutheran city, and the Catholic Mass was not part of his duties. But he wrote it anyway. Perhaps as a gift to the Catholic court in Dresden, perhaps simply because he wanted to, because the text called for it. The Kyrie is a massive 5-voiced fugue pleading for mercy. The Gloria is jubilant, full of trumpets and drums. The Credo is anchored by a fugue on the ancient Gregorian chant, the oldest melody in Christian worship, and it builds through the articles of faith, incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection, each one given its own musical treatment. The Sanctus is radiant, a 6-voice texture that seems to shimmer. This shimmer, the Agnus Dei, is quiet and sorrowful. An alto aria with violin, asking the Lamb of God to grant peace. The Mass is not liturgical music in any practical sense. It is too long, too complex, too expensive to perform. It is more like a compendium, a summation of everything Bach knew about sacred music, a final statement. And it ends not with triumph, but with a plea for peace. The Dona Nobis Pacem, set to the same music as the Gratias Agimus Tibi from the Gloria, as if to say that peace and gratitude are the same thing. It is easy to mythologize Bach, to turn him into a figure of pure intellect or pure devotion, a man who lived entirely in the realm of the spirit. But he was not that. He was a man who fought with employers and worried about money and raised a large family and drank coffee and beer and probably swore when a student sang off key. He was practical and stubborn and ambitious, and he knew his own worth. But he was also someone who believed that music mattered, that it was not a pastime or a luxury, but a necessity, a way of making sense of the world. And he worked at it with a discipline and a focus that few people in any field have ever matched. He got up in the morning and he composed, and he taught, and he performed, and he did it again the next day, for decades, until his body gave out. The last decade of his life was marked by an increasing withdrawal from public musical life. He continued to compose, but he was less interested in producing new cantatas or practical works for the church. He was more interested in solving problems, in exploring the limits of what was possible. The canons he wrote in his last years are almost absurdly complex, puzzles where the solution is beautiful. Some are written in circular notation, so they can be played endlessly, looping back on themselves. Some are mirror canons, where one voice is the upside-down reflection of the other. Some are crab canons, where the second voice plays the first voice backward. They are games, but they are serious games, and they demonstrate a mind that could hold multiple layers of structure in place at once and find the music in them. He was not interested in fame, at least not in the way we understand it. He published a few works, but most of his music circulated only in manuscript, among students and colleagues. He did not tour widely or seek patronage from the great courts. He worked where he was, and he made what he made, and he seems to have been content with that, or at least resigned to it. There is a portrait of him painted by Elias Gottlob Hausmann in 1746, when Bach was 61. It shows a man in a brown coat with a powdered wig, holding a sheet of music, one of the canons, from the musical offering. His face is serious, somewhat stern, the face of someone who does not suffer fools. His eyes look directly at the viewer. There's no softness in the image, no attempt to make him likable. It is the face of a craftsman, someone who knows what he is doing and does not need to explain. After his death, the world moved on. Music changed. The Baroque gave way to the classical, and then the Romantic, and then everything that came after. The taste for elaborate counterpoint faded. Audiences wanted clarity and melody, and drama. The symphony and the string quartet and the piano sonata became the dominant forms. Opera flourished. Bach's music seemed old-fashioned, a relic of a bygone age. But it did not disappear. It survived in the hands of those who knew, who kept playing it and copying it and teaching it. It survived because it was useful, because the well-tempered clavier was the best way to learn keyboard, because the fugues were the best way to learn counterpoint, because the cantatas and passions were too good to let go. And then, in the 19th century, it was rediscovered, and the rediscovery became a kind of religion. The Romantics needed a father figure, a genius who stood outside history, who was both modern and eternal, and they found him in Bach. They built him into a myth, the greatest composer who ever lived, the man who had done everything and said everything and left nothing for the rest of us except to try to understand him. The myth is not entirely wrong, he was that good. But the myth also obscures the man, the working musician, who wrote most of his music for immediate use, who recycled and revised and borrowed from himself and from others, who was sometimes in a hurry and sometimes made mistakes. The myth turns him into marble, And the music is not marble. It is living tissue. In the 20th century, the myth was challenged and complicated. Scholars worked to recover the historical Bach, the man in context, and they found someone more interesting and more human than the monument. Performers worked to recover the sound of his time, and they found that the music could be faster, lighter, more volatile than anyone had thought. And yet the myth persists, because there is something in the music that invites it. The music does feel timeless, not because it is outside history, but because it is so fully inside it, so completely realized that it transcends the circumstances of its making. A fugue from the Well-Tempered Clavier does not sound like 1722. It sounds like music, like thought, like structure made audible. The thing about Bach is that the more you know, the more there is to know. You can listen to a prelude and fugue and hear it as a simple, elegant piece. And then you can analyze it and see how the theme is inverted in the third voice, how the countersubject creates a chain of suspensions, how the harmonic rhythm accelerates toward the cadence, and the piece becomes even more beautiful because you understand what is happening. And then you can listen again and forget the analysis, and just hear it as sound, and it is still beautiful, maybe more so. This is rare. Most music loses something when you take it apart, but Bach's music gains. The structure is not a skeleton hidden beneath the surface. It is the surface. The beauty and the technique are the same thing. There is a recording of the Goldberg Variations made by a young Canadian pianist named Glenn Gould in 1955 that changed how people heard Bach. Gould played fast with no pedal, and he hummed along while he played, and the result was startling. The music sounded modern, almost jazzy, full of energy and clarity. It was not the Bach of churches and reverence. It was the Bach of intelligence and joy. Gould became famous for that recording, and he spent the rest of his life thinking about Bach, recording the partitas and the English suites and the French suites and the Well-Tempered Clavier and the fugues and the concertos. He wrote about Bach, talked about Bach, argued about Bach. He said that Bach was the supreme composer because his music was about structure, not emotion, and structure was eternal. But he was wrong about the emotion, or at least half wrong. Bach's music is about structure, but structure can carry emotion in a way that direct expression cannot. When you hear the subject of a fugue return after an episode, there is a sense of satisfaction, of rightness, that is deeply emotional, even though it is purely formal. When you hear a chorale melody woven into the fabric of a cantata, grounding the listener in a tune they have known since childhood, that is emotional even though it is also theological and structural. Bach understood this, or he intuited it, or he simply did it, without thinking about it, because he was not a theorist, he was a maker. He made music the way a carpenter makes furniture, with care and skill, and a sense of what the material could do. The 6 Brandenburg concertos are a kind of miracle. Each one is scored for a different combination of instruments, and each one explores a different texture, a different way of making sound. The first concerto has 2 horns, 3 oboes, a bassoon, a violino piccolo, strings, and continuo, and it is festive and outdoor, full of hunting calls and dance rhythms. The second concerto has a trumpet, a recorder, an oboe, a violin, and continuo, and it is a conversation among equals, the trumpet brilliant and the other instruments agile and quick. The third concerto is for strings alone, divided into 3 groups, and it is warm and unified, everyone singing together. The fourth concerto features a solo violin and 2 recorders, and it is pastoral and elegant. The fifth concerto has a long solo for the harpsichord, nearly 2 minutes of virtuoso display, which was unprecedented. The harpsichord was usually a continuo instrument, filling in the harmonies, not a soloist. The sixth concerto is for low strings only, violas and cellos and bass, and it is dark and rich, exploring a sound world that no one else thought to write for. They are perfect. Not perfect in the sense of flawless, because there are moments where the writing is awkward or the balance is difficult, but perfect in the sense of complete, fully imagined, exactly what they need to be. After Bach died, the manuscripts were scattered. Some went to Carl Philipp Emanuel, some to Wilhelm Friedemann, some to other students and collectors. The Brandenburg concertos ended up in the library of the Margrave of Brandenburg, unperformed and forgotten, until they were rediscovered in the 19th century. The St. Matthew Passion was nearly lost. The Art of Fugue was published by Bach's sons after his death, but it sold poorly. The plates were eventually melted down. Anna Magdalena lived in poverty, dependent on charity from the town council and from her stepsons, though the help was irregular. She died in 1760, 10 years after her husband, and was buried in a pauper's grave. None of the music she had copied, none of the household she had managed, none of the children she had raised, secured her any comfort in old age. The children scattered. Wilhelm Friedemann, the eldest and perhaps the most gifted, never found a stable position and died in poverty. Carl Philipp Emanuel became famous and successful, Kapellmeister in Hamburg, a composer of the new style, and he kept his father's manuscripts and legacy alive. Johann Christoph Friedrich and Johann Christian both found success, the latter becoming the London Bach, famous for his operas and symphonies. But none of them wrote like their father. The world had moved on. The new style was lighter, more melodic, less interested in counterpoint. The symphony and the sonata were replacing the fugue and the concerto grosso. The age of the Baroque was over, and Bach's music seemed like a relic of it, and yet it did not die. It persisted, quietly, in the hands of those who knew. In Vienna, Baron van Swieten held Sunday morning concerts where he played Bach's music for a small circle of enthusiasts. Mozart attended and was astonished. He wrote to his wife, "I am collecting the fugues of Bach, not only Sebastian's, but Emanuel's and Friedemann's as well." He began to incorporate contrapuntal techniques into his own music, writing fugues, and using imitative textures in a way he had not before. Beethoven knew the well-tempered clavier by heart. He played it as a child, and he returned to it throughout his life. When he was struggling with the late string quartets, he studied Bach's fugues, and the influence is audible in the Grosse Fuge and in the final movement of the string quartet in C-sharp minor, where he writes a fugue of astonishing complexity and intensity. The 19th century turned Bach into a monument. The Bach Gesellschaft published a complete edition of his works, 46 volumes over 50 years. Scholars catalogued his compositions, studied his life, pieced together the chronology. Performers began to play his music in concerts, though often with romantic additions. Large orchestras added dynamics, sentimental interpretations that he would not have recognized. But the music survived the interpretations. It survived being turned into a symbol of German culture, into a proof of national genius. It survived being played badly and being played well. It survived because it is strong enough to withstand anything. In the 20th century, the historicist movement tried to strip away the romantic accretions and recover the original sound. Performers used period instruments, studied historical tuning and temperament, researched performance practices. The result was a leaner, faster, more transparent Bach, and it was controversial. Some people loved it, some people hated it, but it opened up the music again, made it new. And then there was Gould, who ignored the period instruments and played on a modern piano and made Bach sound like the future. And there were jazz musicians who took the fugues and turned them into improvisations. And there were avant-garde composers who used his techniques in electronic music. And there were filmmakers who used his music to score everything from Space Odysseys to Meditations on War. Bach is everywhere because his music is flexible enough to mean many things, and strong enough to survive many uses. It can be devotional or intellectual, intimate or grand, ancient or modern, depending on how you listen. But at the center of it, underneath all the interpretations and uses, is the work itself, the notes on the page, the structures he built. And those structures are astonishing. They are the work of someone who understood music, not as a surface, but as an architecture, not as a decoration, but as a language capable of complex thought. A fugue is a thought. It begins with a question, the subject, and then it explores that question from every angle, turning it upside down, stretching it, compressing it, combining it with other ideas, until the question has been fully examined and the answer, if there is one, has emerged. A cantata is a sermon in sound. It takes the scripture reading and the hymn and the theological point and weaves them together, using every resource of music, melody, harmony, rhythm, texture, color to make the meaning clear and felt. A prelude is a meditation. It establishes a mood, a key, a world, and it invites you to enter and stay a while. Bach did not invent these forms, but he brought them to a level of perfection that no one has equaled. And he did it not by being radical or revolutionary, but by being thorough, by taking the tools he had been given and using them as fully as possible. He was not trying to break the rules, he was trying to fulfill them, to show what they could do if you followed them all the way to the end. And what he found was that the rules, pushed far enough, become freedom. This is the paradox that defines his music and his legacy. The most rule-bound music ever written is also the most free. The most intellectual music ever written is also the most emotional. The most sacred music ever written is also the most universal. He believed that music was a form of worship, that to compose was to praise God, and every note he wrote was offered in that spirit. But the music does not require belief to be understood or felt. You do not need to be a Lutheran or a Christian or religious at all to hear what is happening in a fugue or a cantata. You only need to listen. There is a moment in the St. John Passion after Jesus has been crucified, when the bass sings an aria, Mein Teure Heiland, my precious Savior, asking whether Jesus' death has freed him from his sins. The bass is accompanied by the chorus, which keeps interrupting with the single word, ja, yes, like a heartbeat, like a promise. It is a moment of extraordinary tenderness, and it is also a moment of extraordinary structure, the two voices interlocking in a way that is both simple and profound. That is Bach. The tenderness and the structure are not separate, they are the same thing. The feeling is in the notes, in the way they move and relate, in the architecture of the sound. He was not a mystic or a visionary in the way we usually understand those words. He did not claim to have visions or hear voices. He did not claim to have visions. He was a craftsman, a working musician, a man who believed that music was a gift and that his job was to use it as well as he could. But the work he made is visionary because it shows us something about the world that we cannot see any other way. It shows us that order and beauty are not opposed, that complexity and clarity can coexist, that the individual and the whole can be in harmony. It shows us in sound what a just and beautiful world might feel like. This is why his music endures. Not because it is old or because it is sacred, or because it is German, or because it is technically impressive, though it is all of those things. It endures because it is true. It tells the truth about structure and feeling, about time and eternity, about the relationship between the one and the many, and it does so in a language that anyone can hear, if they are willing to listen. You do not need to know music theory to hear a fugue. You do not need to read German to hear a cantata. You only need to be present, to let the sound unfold, to follow the voices as they weave and converge. In the end, Bach's life was ordinary. He was born. He worked, he married, he had children, he taught, he composed, he fought with his employers, he grew old, he went blind, he died, he was buried and forgotten, and his music was scattered and lost. But the music was not lost. But the music was not lost. It was recovered piece by piece, manuscript by manuscript, and it was played again, and it was heard again, and it was loved again. And now, nearly 3 centuries after his death, it is more alive than ever. The well-tempered clavier is still the foundation of keyboard pedagogy. The Brandenburg concertos are still performed in concert halls around the world. The St. Matthew Passion is still sung in churches and theaters, and people still weep when they hear Erbarm dich. The fugues are still studied by composers who want to learn how to think in sound. He is the god of Western classical music, the figure that every composer after him has had to reckon with. But he is also something more human than a god. He is a model of what it means to work with care and skill and devotion, to take the materials you are given and use them as fully as you can, to believe that what you make matters even if no one notices, to keep going even when the world does not understand. He did not write for posterity. He wrote for Sunday services and for students and for himself. He wrote because it was his job and because he loved it and because he believed it was what he was supposed to do. And somehow, against all odds, the work survived, and it speaks to us now as clearly as it spoke to the congregations of Leipzig. The music asks nothing of us except that we listen. It does not demand belief or knowledge or sophistication. It simply unfolds, voice by voice, line by line, and if we follow it, it takes us somewhere we could not go on our own. There is a recording of the Goldberg Variations made by Glenn Gould in 1981, the last recording he made before his death. It is slower than his first recording, more reflective, less exuberant. The aria at the beginning is played with a kind of quiet attention, as if he is noticing every note for the first time. The variations unfold with patience, each one given space to breathe. And then, at the end, the aria returns, the same notes as at the beginning, but they sound different now, weighted with everything that has come between. It is the same with Bach's music as a whole. You can hear it once, and it is beautiful. You can hear it 100 times, and it is still beautiful. But now you hear things you did not hear before: a voice entering, a harmonic shift, a moment where the structure opens up and reveals something unexpected. The music is inexhaustible because it is not trying to show you everything at once. It is content to be what it is, to unfold in its own time, to let you discover it at your own pace. And so the work continues, long after the man is gone. The manuscripts are edited and re-edited. The performances are recorded and debated. The scholars argue about chronology and attribution. The pianists and organists and violinists and singers work through the pieces, learning the notes and the phrases and the structures, and somewhere in that work they find something that matters to them, something that speaks. Bach would have understood this. He believed that music was not a finished object, but a living practice, something you did, something you participated in. The notes on the page were only the beginning. The music happened when someone played them, when the fingers moved and the air vibrated and the sound filled the room. He is not a monument. He is a presence, a voice that keeps speaking, a way of thinking and feeling that is still available to anyone who wants to learn it. And so the story does not end. It continues in practice rooms, in concert halls, in churches and living rooms, wherever someone sits down to play a prelude or sing a chorale or listen to a fugue. The work he made is still being made, over and over, every time it is performed, every time it is performed, every time it is heard. The man himself is gone, 3 centuries gone, and the world he lived in is gone. The courts and churches and towns, the candles and manuscripts and clunky instruments. But the music remains, clear and strong, a structure built from sound that has outlasted everything else. It is there if you want it. All you have to do is listen.